Shindand Air Base, Western Afghanistan, February 2009. Colonel Mark Reynolds, commander of one of the largest American installations in the region, sat alone in his office, staring at a report that should not have existed. According to the document, 4 British soldiers had approached the main gate less than an hour earlier, without prior clearance, without authorization codes, and without any attempt to follow standard entry procedure. The guards did exactly what they were trained to do. They denied access. The British soldiers didn't argue. They didn't push. They asked a few casual questions about helicopter schedules, thanked the guards, and walked away into the dust beyond the wire. That should have been the end of it. Instead, 40 minutes later, those same 4 men were found inside the base, not near the perimeter, not hiding, walking calmly through a restricted zone nearly a kilometer from the gate, heading toward a special operations compound as if they belonged there. When a patrol intercepted them at gunpoint, they stopped without resistance. One of them stepped forward, relaxed, almost polite, and said they were SAS. They were looking for a liaison office. They spoke like men who expected the situation to resolve itself. The patrol leader demanded to know how they had entered. The answer came without hesitation. We walked in. The words hung in the air like an insult. The base perimeter was layered with fencing, sensors, towers, and constant patrols. Every approach was monitored. There was no walking in. Yet there they were, dust on their boots, completely inside the secure zone. No alarms had triggered. No guards had seen them pass. No cameras had caught anything useful. They hadn't broken in. They hadn't forced anything. They had simply appeared where they weren't supposed to exist. Reynolds ordered an immediate review. Every sensor log was checked. Every camera angle analyzed. Tower guards were questioned twice. Patrol routes were reconstructed minute by minute. Nothing, no breach, no failure, no explanation. The system had worked exactly as designed. And still, 4 foreign soldiers had walked straight through it. What made it worse was the pattern. Within hours, intelligence officers pulled older reports from other bases, Herat, Jalalabad, even a logistics hub near Mazar-e-Sharif. Different dates, different teams, same outcome. British SAS operators appearing inside restricted areas without clearance and without a trace of how they got there. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't luck. It was a capability. And that realization made people nervous. Because if allies could do this, enemies eventually could too. The Americans treated it like a breach. The British didn't. When contacted, their liaison officer apologized in a tone that suggested confusion more than regret. From their perspective, nothing extraordinary had happened. They had needed access. They had found a way. That was the job. The idea that base security rules should stop them didn't fully register. To them, those systems were obstacles, not boundaries. Training opportunities, not restrictions. That difference in thinking didn't cause immediate conflict, but it planted something dangerous. Because it meant both sides were looking at the same situation and seeing completely different problems. The earlier incidents had already hinted at it. In late 2001, at a forward airfield near Kandahar, an American logistics officer found British soldiers inside a restricted ammunition zone in the middle of the night. They weren't stealing. They weren't hiding. They were studying equipment, handling weapons with professional curiosity. When challenged, They identified themselves calmly and explained they were familiarizing themselves with available systems in case they needed to use similar equipment in the field. It sounded reasonable. It also made no sense. They had bypassed checkpoints that required clearance codes. Guards on duty swore nobody had passed them. When asked how they got in, the answer was vague. "We found a way." It was the same phrase, different words, the same quiet refusal to explain, the same calm confidence that made it hard to tell whether they were being cooperative or dismissive. 3 weeks later, at another installation, a similar report surfaced. This time it was an intelligence facility, restricted access, controlled entry, verified personnel only. And yet, a British operator had been found inside reviewing mission reports, not copying them, not hiding, just reading, like he belonged there. When confronted, he gave a simple explanation. He needed the information. His unit was operating in the area. He didn't have time to wait for formal approval. Again, technically logical. Completely unacceptable from a security standpoint. Again, no clear explanation of how he had entered. And again, no signs of forced access or system failure. By 2003, it wasn't isolated anymore. It was a pattern that refused to behave like one. The Americans responded the way they always did: tighten procedures, reinforce rules, increase control, more ID checks, more patrols, more restricted zones, more paperwork. Every layer designed to close gaps. And every time a gap closed, another one seemed to open somewhere else. The British adapted faster than the system could adjust. Not with technology, not with brute force, with timing, awareness, confidence. They moved through structures the way water moves through cracks, finding the one place pressure wasn't being applied. Guards didn't see intruders. They saw someone who looked like he was supposed to be there. That was enough. The tension didn't explode right away. It built slowly, quietly, through reports that sounded almost absurd when read individually. Each incident was explainable on its own. A distracted guard, a missed log entry, a camera angle that didn't quite cover everything. But together they formed something harder to ignore. A pattern that suggested the system wasn't being broken. It was being bypassed without ever triggering a failure. And that was worse. Because you can fix a broken system. You can't easily fix one that doesn't even realize it's been beaten. By the time Reynolds finished reviewing the Shindand incident, he understood that the report wasn't about 4 soldiers walking into a base. It was about something much bigger. A difference in how 2 Allied forces understood control. The Americans believed security came from structure, layers, protocols, verification. The British SAS operated on something else entirely: initiative, adaptability. The assumption that if something stood between you and the objective, it was there to be solved, not respected. Neither side thought they were wrong, and that was the real problem. Because it meant the situation wouldn't correct itself. It would escalate. And it did. By 2004, what had started as a series of strange incidents was turning into something far more serious. American bases across Afghanistan were built around control, layers of access, identification checks, restricted zones, and constant monitoring. Every movement was supposed to be tracked, every person accounted for. The system wasn't perfect, but it was structured, predictable, and designed to minimize uncertainty. That structure worked against insurgents. It did not work against the SAS. They weren't forcing entry. They weren't breaking locks or cutting fences. They were moving through the system without triggering it, using timing, awareness, and something harder to define: confidence. They didn't behave like intruders. They behaved like they belonged. And that was often enough. In early 2005, the situation escalated at a secure planning facility on a coalition base near Kabul. The building was used for joint operational briefings, intelligence updates, target coordination, mission planning. Access was tightly controlled. Entry lists were verified in advance. Guards were posted at every point of entry. Inside, only cleared personnel were allowed. The briefing had already begun when something felt off. An American officer presenting intelligence paused mid-sentence, his attention shifting to the back of the room. There was a man sitting there, taking notes, completely calm, completely unremarkable. Just another uniform in a room full of them. Except he wasn't on the list. No one remembered seeing him enter. The room went quiet as security approached. The man looked up, relaxed, almost indifferent to the tension building around him. When asked to identify himself, he did so without hesitation. British Army, SAS. He explained in a steady voice that his unit needed the intelligence being presented, so he came to collect it. The explanation was simple, too simple. The next question came immediately. How did you get in? He didn't hesitate. He said he walked in. The guards had been busy processing other personnel before the briefing started. There had been a moment, a gap in attention, and he used it. No fake credentials, no forced access, just timing. The briefing stopped, the building was locked down, every entry point was reviewed, guards were questioned, camera footage was pulled and analyzed. The result was the same as in previous incidents. No clear breach, no obvious failure. Just a man who should not have been there, sitting inside one of the most controlled environments on the base. From a tactical standpoint, it was impressive. From a security standpoint, it was a nightmare. American command treated it as a serious violation. This wasn't just about access anymore. This was about classified information, operational planning, and the integrity of the entire system. If one person could walk into a restricted briefing without being challenged, then the system wasn't just flawed. It was vulnerable in a way that couldn't be easily fixed. The British response followed a familiar pattern. They didn't deny what had happened. They didn't even argue about the facts. Instead, they explained the reasoning. SAS operators were trained to access restricted environments. It was a core skill. If they couldn't enter a guarded facility under controlled conditions, how could they be expected to infiltrate enemy positions during real operations? The logic made sense within their framework, but it completely missed the point. For the Americans, this wasn't about whether the skill was useful. It was about where and how it was being used. There was a difference between infiltrating an enemy compound and walking into a secure Allied briefing without authorization. One was a mission, the other was a breach. The gap between those perspectives was becoming impossible to ignore. Over the next months, more incidents surfaced. Some were minor, others weren't. British operators were found in restricted maintenance zones, near aircraft areas, inside logistics compounds. Always with a reason, always with a calm explanation, and almost never with a clear answer about how they got there. What made it worse was the pattern behind it. These weren't random mistakes or isolated acts. There was consistency, the same methods, the same results. They weren't just accessing areas, they were testing the system, whether intentionally or not. At one base in southern Afghanistan, patrols began noticing signs of movement near the perimeter at irregular hours. Not attempts to break in, but controlled approaches, close enough to trigger certain sensors, then gone before a full response could be organized. At first, it was assumed to be insurgent reconnaissance, but the behavior didn't match. It was too precise, too controlled. Later, it became clear those movements had been conducted by SAS teams. They were studying reaction times, observing patrol patterns, identifying how quickly different layers of security responded under pressure. From their perspective, it was valuable information. From the American perspective, it was unacceptable, because it meant Allied forces were effectively probing active defenses in a combat zone without coordination. That carried real risk. Guards didn't know who was out there in the dark. They reacted to threats, not identities. A misinterpretation, a sudden movement, a delayed response, any of it could have led to engagement. And once that happened, there would be no time to clarify who was on which side. The Americans responded the way they always did, by tightening control. More checks, more restrictions. Stricter movement policies for all foreign personnel. On paper, it applied to everyone. In practice, it was aimed at one group. But even as procedures became more rigid, the core issue remained untouched. The system assumed cooperation. It assumed that everyone inside it accepted the same boundaries. The SAS didn't operate that way, not because they were reckless, but because they were trained differently. They didn't see barriers the same way. Where others saw a rule, they saw a problem to solve. Where others waited for clearance, they moved forward, if the objective required it. That mindset made them effective in combat. It also made them unpredictable inside a structured environment. By late 2005, frustration was building on both sides. American commanders saw repeated violations that undermined security. British operators saw unnecessary restrictions that slowed down operations. Neither side felt they were wrong. Neither side was willing to adjust the core of how they operated. The situation was no longer sustainable. It hadn't exploded yet, but it was close. And when it finally did, it wouldn't be another quiet incident report or a closed-door argument. It would be something bigger, something that forced both sides to stop pretending this was just a misunderstanding. By 2007, the situation had moved beyond reports and quiet disagreements. It had become operationally dangerous. The breaking point came at a large coalition base in Helmand Province, Camp Valiant, a heavily fortified installation under Postoyanum Davlenium insurgent forces. The base had already been attacked before. Rockets had landed inside the perimeter. Patrols had been hit outside the wire. Security here wasn't theoretical. It was survival. Just after midnight on a warm August night, the first motion sensor triggered along the eastern perimeter. That alone wasn't unusual. Sensors reacted to animals, wind, and debris all the time. But this activation wasn't random. It came in sequence. One sensor, then another, moving along the perimeter in a clear pattern. Observation posts were alerted immediately. Night optics scanned the darkness beyond the wire. At first, nothing. Then shapes. Low, controlled movement. Pausing. Advancing again. The report moved fast. Possible reconnaissance. Quick reaction forces were activated within seconds. Vehicles rolled out, controlled and precise. Some sectors were darkened to preserve night vision. Others lit up to expose movement. Radios filled with short, focused transmissions. No panic. Just trained escalation. The assumption was simple. Taliban scouts testing defenses before a larger attack. The QRF closed in quickly. As they approached, the shapes became clearer. 4 individuals moving tactically, spaced apart, using terrain. But something was wrong. They weren't retreating. They weren't rushing. They were still there. When commands were shouted, loud and direct, the figures stopped. That didn't match any known pattern. Lights came up, weapons locked onto targets, orders repeated, hands visible. Slowly, deliberately, the 4 figures raised their hands. Then they removed their face coverings. They weren't insurgents. They were British. For a moment, nobody spoke. The entire response had been built on one assumption: that this was an enemy probe. It wasn't. The team leader stepped forward, voice tight, demanding identification. The answer came calm. SAS training exercise. They had been testing base security. The words hit harder than any threat. Inside Camp Valiant, the reaction was immediate. The base had already shifted into a defensive posture. Helicopter crews were on standby. Indirect fire units were ready. Dozens of personnel had mobilized, believing they were responding to a real attack. And now, it was a test. Uncoordinated, unauthorized, unannounced. The 4 operators were escorted inside and separated for questioning. There was no confusion about what had happened. Only one question mattered. Why? Why simulate an enemy probe against a live base in a combat zone without warning? The answer didn't change. They needed a real assessment. If the base knew it was being tested, the results would be meaningless. Guards would react differently. Systems would perform better under expectation. The only way to measure real readiness was to create a situation that felt real, because it was real. From one perspective, the logic was sound. From another, it was reckless. The risk had been immediate. If the responding unit had reacted even slightly differently, if someone had misread movement, those 4 men could have been engaged as hostile targets. There would have been no time to identify them. The American response was sharp. This wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a dangerous act that had triggered a full defensive response. The British didn't deny the risk, but they focused on the result. They had approached to within roughly 50 meters of the perimeter before detection. That gap mattered. A real enemy could have used it. To them, the test had worked. To the Americans, the method made it unacceptable, because it showed that Allied forces were willing to create real threat conditions without coordination. The incident escalated quickly through command channels. Reports moved up. Questions followed. Who authorized this? Was it isolated? Had it happened before? The answers made things worse. The team had internal approval, and similar activities had been conducted before. Smaller, less visible, but consistent. In several cases, successful penetrations of base security had been recorded within British channels and never shared with American command. That changed the situation completely. This was no longer just about access. It was about information. From the American perspective, vulnerabilities in base defenses had been identified and not reported through official channels. That wasn't just a disagreement. It was a security issue. The response was immediate. New directives were issued across major American bases in Afghanistan. Officially, they were framed as coordination measures for coalition forces. In reality, they targeted one group. British SAS operators were now subject to strict controls. 72 hours advance notice before visiting. Mandatory escort on base. Restricted access to sensitive areas without written authorization. Additional security screening. On paper, it was about coordination. In practice, it was about control. For the first time, British Special Forces were being treated not just as allies, but as a risk that needed to be managed. The official British response came through formal channels, protests, objections, arguments about operational impact. But among the operators, the reaction was different. Quieter, simpler. The new rules didn't look like limits. They looked like obstacles, and obstacles were meant to be bypassed. The new restrictions didn't solve the problem. They only changed its shape. On paper, the system was now airtight. Advance notice, escorts, limited access, additional checks. Every movement by British SAS on American bases was supposed to be controlled. Every step accounted for. Every presence explained. In reality, almost nothing changed. Within weeks, reports began surfacing again. Isolated at first, then more consistent. British operators appearing in places they weren't scheduled to be. Restricted areas, maintenance zones, sections of base that required clearance they hadn't requested. Each time, the pattern was the same. They were calm, polite, cooperative on the surface, and completely unapologetic in practice. When confronted, they would acknowledge the rules. Sometimes they would claim they hadn't been fully briefed on the new procedures. Sometimes they would simply apologize and step back. And then, days or weeks later, it would happen again. Not in the same place, not in the same way, but always with the same result. They got where they needed to go. The American command structure found itself in an increasingly absurd position. These weren't enemies. They weren't infiltrators in the traditional sense. They were allies, highly capable, highly respected, and essential in certain operations. And yet, they behaved in ways that made standard security meaningless. The problem wasn't hostility. It was incompatibility. American base security depended on a shared understanding. Rules weren't just barriers, they were agreements. Everyone inside the system accepted them, followed them, reinforced them. That was what made the system work. The SAS didn't operate on that principle. They operated on necessity. If something needed to be done, they did it. If a rule slowed them down, they worked around it. Not out of disrespect, but because that was how they had been trained. That was how they had survived in environments where hesitation meant failure. That mindset didn't adapt well to a structured, multinational environment. And by late 2007, it became clear that no amount of coordination would fix it. The solution that emerged wasn't written as a formal agreement. It wasn't announced publicly. But it was understood by everyone involved. Separation. British SAS units began operating almost exclusively from British-controlled facilities, bases like Camp Bastion and smaller forward positions where their methods didn't conflict with another system. Logistics, planning, and coordination were handled through liaison officers instead of direct integration. Joint operations still happened, but they happened in the field, not inside shared bases where rules and expectations clashed. American installations remained technically open to British forces, but in practice access became difficult enough that it was rarely worth the effort. The layers of approval, the escorts, the restrictions, they didn't stop the SAS. They simply made it easier to avoid the system entirely. From the American perspective, It restored a degree of control. Base security could function as intended without unpredictable variables moving through it. From the British perspective, it removed unnecessary constraints. They could operate the way they were designed to operate, independently, flexibly, without constant friction. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it worked. What made the situation more frustrating for American commanders was that this issue didn't exist with other Allied units. Australian, Canadian, German, Polish special forces all operated within the same environment without repeatedly bypassing security or ignoring procedures. The difference wasn't in capability, it was in culture. The SAS had been built differently from the beginning, designed to operate outside conventional structures, to act independently, to solve problems without waiting for permission. That approach had proven effective for decades. It produced results in places where rigid systems failed, but it also created friction in environments where structure mattered. American Special Operations Forces were trained to integrate into a larger system. They operated with discipline, coordination, and respect for chain of command as a core principle. Their effectiveness came from combining elite capability with structured control. The SAS came from the opposite direction. Their effectiveness came from autonomy, from the ability to act without waiting, from the assumption that rules could be bent if the situation required it. Neither approach was wrong, but they weren't compatible in the same space. By the time coalition operations in Afghanistan began to wind down, the separation had become standard practice. British SAS units operated from their own bases. Coordination with American forces happened through controlled channels. Joint missions were planned with clear boundaries. The constant friction that had defined earlier years faded. Not because the differences disappeared, but because both sides stopped trying to force those differences into the same system. Years later, officers who had been involved reflected on the situation with a mix of frustration and respect. American commanders acknowledged that the SAS had exposed real vulnerabilities. Their methods had revealed gaps that traditional testing might have missed. They had forced improvements, even if the way they did it was difficult to accept. British operators, in turn, understood, at least to a degree, why the reaction had been so strong. A live base in a combat zone wasn't the same as a training ground. The margin for error was too small. But neither side changed its core philosophy. And that was the real lesson. The conflict had never been about individual incidents. It had been about how two highly effective systems defined effectiveness itself. One valued control. The other valued freedom. One relied on structure. The other relied on initiative. Both worked, but not together. In the end, there was no official ban. No signed document that declared British SAS unwelcome on American bases. Nothing that could be pointed to as a clear line in policy. But everyone who operated there understood the reality. The access was restricted. The movement was controlled. And the distance between the two systems was intentional. It wasn't a failure of cooperation. It was a recognition of limits. Because in war, the most dangerous problems aren't always caused by enemies. Sometimes they come from allies who operate just differently enough to break the rules without ever meaning to. And when that happens, the solution isn't always to change them. Sometimes the only solution is to step back and give each other space to fight the same war in different ways.